This series contains adult language and includes content that some listeners may find disturbing. Listener discretion is strongly advised. For Murder Creek Media, this is Skeptical. I'm your host, Neeli Faulkner. This is Season 1, Episode 5. If you're just now tuning into Skeptical, this is one story told week by week. So if you haven't listened to our episodes in sequential order, go back to Episode 1 and start from the beginning. Last week on Skeptical.
Tony, I'm Agent Thornton. This is Officer Anderson. The time is 12:05 a.m. Today's date, Wednesday, March 22nd, 1995. At this time, I'm advising you of your rights.
Can you tell me how you knew Tony Quince? Like, how did you meet him?
My first time ever meeting Tony Quince?
Uh-huh.
I was sitting in the, still been a courtroom, right? Alright, and you know how they get the people that's been convicted of crimes and stuff, they make them sit up there with juries at, right?
Uh-huh.
And that's my first time ever meeting Tony Quince.
Place you under arrest for the capital murder of Michael Burns.
English poet William Shenstone once wrote, "A liar begins with making falsehood appear like truth and ends with making truth itself appear like falsehood." I thought about this quote a lot while investigating Daniel's case. I had learned so much about the events surrounding July 27, 1994. Intimate details about the weeks leading up to Mike's murder until years after his death. And still I wrestled with my own thoughts and emotions regarding the facts. Daniel didn't seem to me to be this cunning manipulator at the surface. I had spoken to him every week for almost a year. Sometimes we'd discuss the case, but other times were more lighthearted conversations, like about what he did that day or what plans his family had for Christmas. But as I thought about it more and more, I realized that manipulators often twist the truth to appear like a lie, or a lie to appear as the truth. Think about famous manipulators, such as Ted Bundy. Bundy was notorious for blurring the lines between truth and falsehood, something that afforded him the ability to elude law enforcement for quite a while. As the weeks and even years went on, Daniel's actions bore an uncanny resemblance to Bundy's manipulative tactics, making it difficult for me to discern the truth. Pulling information out of him was exhausting, and I was tired of having to piece together information. I didn't want to make the same mistake of what I had accused investigators of doing, stretching the facts to fit a narrative. Only this time, my narrative was a claim of innocence. Yet, just as I was convinced of Daniel's guilt, new evidence surfaced that made me question everything I knew about this case. Evidence that was hard to overlook and easily told a story that dismantled law enforcement's theory.
So, let me ask you, the people that testified that they had heard him say this or heard he did that or whatnot, I'm sure you were aware they were in prison when they heard it. Did you put any weight into that, or was that just extra on top of what you already knew?
Well, let me tell you this. The guy that was with him knew all the details of everything that happened. He was right there with him. So even though that's still another criminal, how would he have known all of that if they didn't do it? I mean, if he wouldn't, there's no way he could have known what he knew.
What you just heard is a clip from a call I had with Mr. A, one of the jurors in Daniel's case I spoke with. He's being asked about the testimony of 3 witnesses, Richard Edge, Timothy Marshall, and Butch Gibbs, all inmates at the time they testified as witnesses for the prosecution. These 3 men are important to the story because they help to give credibility to William Price, whom we spoke about in the last episode. Price's testimony connected Daniel and Tony through the sale of an altered firearm, whereas Marshall, Gibbs, and Edge's testimony connects them through conversations while incarcerated. With all of their statements combined, the prosecution was able to show that not only did Daniel and Tony know each other, but they conspired together to commit this crime. In April of 1995, Timothy Marshall and Butch Gibbs were both incarcerated at the Chilton County Jail. They were each awaiting trial when Daniel was placed in the same cell with them. During this same time, Tony was also in the Chilton County Jail, placed in a different cell than Marshall, Gibbs, and Daniel. Marshall testified that when Daniel was brought into the jail, he asked him if he knew Tony Quince was in a neighboring cell. According to Marshall, Daniel said he was aware, and shortly after Marshall overheard a short conversation between Daniel and Tony, where Tony hollered to Daniel from 2 cells down. During the trial, he didn't elaborate on what Tony had said first, but he said Daniel's response to Tony was, quote, "Don't worry about it." The testimony of Butch Gibbs was pretty similar, as he tells the jury that Daniel and Tony did have a short conversation. He said Daniel told Tony he was arrested on a gun charge, but he also elaborates on the conversation. When ADA Stephanie Billingsley asked Gibbs, "What else did Danny tell Tony?" Gibbs responds, quote, "They didn't have nothing on him, you know. The numbers had been filed off the gun they had got there, but they didn't have no evidence on him." When Gibbs described this gun to Billingsley, he notes that Daniel claimed it was the gun used to kill his father. But we know that can't be true due to the ballistics testimony we discussed in the last episode. The gun in question was a .380 caliber, but the 2 weapons used to murder Mike were a .22 and a .38 or a .357 caliber. This was one of several inconsistencies I noted. For example, when I compared Marshall's witness testimony to his trial testimony, I noticed Greg Biggs had left something out, something that seemed important to me, so I was confused as to why he wouldn't discuss this in front of the jury. In Marshall's written statement to Agent Carl Youngblood, he says that a few months later, in September of 1995, he was placed in a cell with Tony Quince for about 3 weeks. He said during that time, Tony told him that Danny had set up his father's residence to be robbed, believing he'd be out of town. But while Quince was in the home, Mike came home and sat in his recliner. He said Tony told him he was scared of being discovered in the house, so he shot Mike before leaving. Here's my buddy John reading the written statement from Marshall, given in September of 1995, 5 months after he had spent 1 day in jail with Daniel.
On or about April 95, I was an inmate at the Chilton County Jail. Sometime after that, I was in a jail cell with Jack Crockett, and then Tony Quince was brought in and put into the cell with us. I stayed in the cell with them for about 3 weeks. When Tony was first brought in, I asked him why he was in there. Tony told me that he was in there on a charge that I couldn't remember. Later on, or about a week or so, Tony told me that he had a murder charge on him. Then said that this dude owed him some money for some crack and that we went into the boy's house to rob it. He said that while we were in there, in the house, somebody came home and he was scared and he, Tony, shot him. Tony stated that he shot the man after the man came into the house. About 3 weeks to a month later or so, a white guy was brought into the jail. He said that his name was Danny, and he told me that he was in there because they had found a gun with the serial number filed off of it in his possession. Butch Gibbs then made the statement to me, "That's the boy whose daddy Tony shot." After they put Danny into the cell with us, we asked him if he knew Tony was in there. I had been out on probation and sentenced on another charge and put into a different cell from Tony. Anyway, we asked him if he knew Tony was in there, and he said, yeah. He also said, "That's the one who shot my daddy." Danny then hollered at Tony, "Hey, Tony, what's going on, man?" Tony then said, "Nothing." Tony then asked him what he was in there for. Danny also told Tony that he was in there on a gun charge where the serial number had been filed off. Tony then said, "What's up?" And Danny said, "Nothing, don't worry about it." Tony then said, "All right."
Like with Marshall's testimony, it appeared that Gibbs' testimony had been cut short, leaving out portions of this supposed conversation between Daniel and Tony at trial. Here's another friend of mine, Tyrell, reading Butch Gibbs' written statement to the ABI, given about a week earlier than Marshall's statement, almost 4 months after the event he's speaking about.
I spent several hours in the cell with Danny Bland in May 1995. When Danny first got there, he and Tony acted like they didn't know one another. Me and Tommy Knight asked Danny what he was in there for. He told us he sold a gun with something wrong with the number, and the police thought the gun was used to kill his dad or something. He told us about his dad being a coach at Verbena and that he'd been murdered, and the police think a boy by the name of Tony Quince had done it. We told him Tony Quince was 2 cells down, and then he didn't say nothing. We gambled for a while, and Tony and Danny got to passing messages back and forth to each other. Tony asked Danny what all the police asked him. Danny told Tony that he was in there on a weapons charge. Tony asked Danny if they asked anything about him. Danny said all they wanted to know was about the gun. Tony said they didn't have nothing on me. Tony asked Danny, did they find the gun? Danny said, I ain't told them nothing. They talked back and forth, and Danny told Tony is all they want to know is about the gun, and I ain't told them nothing. I saw Tony's brother and Tony's girlfriend throw marijuana and crack across the fence to Tony. Danny told me he used to use crack a lot when he lived down there, but then he moved up there, he only smokes marijuana now. You could tell that they knew each other, even at first. They acted like they didn't.
Unfortunately, Daniel's attorneys didn't do much as far as a cross-examination. They never brought up the fact that the information in the witness statements differed from their testimony, or the fact that Gibbs claimed the altered firearm was the one used to murder Mike. It seemed to me that his attorneys had not even read over the witness statements. In fact, I learned that Daniel's attorneys never even requested the transcripts from Tony's trial several months earlier. And if they had, they would have noticed a few inconsistencies in testimony from Marshall and Gibbs in that trial. For example, Biggs' recollection of the conversation between Daniel and Tony starts out a bit differently. In Tony's trial, Gibbs tells District Attorney Greg Biggs that before Tony was brought into the jail, he had briefly discussed Mike's murder with Daniel, and that Daniel told him he had owed some money for some dope before Tony Quince was brought into the jail. It's possible the judge may not have allowed certain information to be let into the trial, or maybe the attorneys didn't feel the information was pertinent. But what would you say if I told you that, had Daniel's attorneys obtained Tony's trial transcripts, they would have noticed another piece of information that could exclude these two witnesses altogether?
Do you recall on that day saying he, referring to Tony, he said that while they were in the house, somebody come home and he was scared and he, Tony, shot him? Do you remember saying that?
If it's on the statement, it's been 2 years ago, all right? I don't remember what was said at all. There was plenty said about it.
Was there any discussion made about your incarceration?
I imagine so, yes, sir.
Well, I suspect there was a little discussion about what you're being charged with, and you're back in jail.
I ain't accusing the man of doing it. I'm just telling you what I heard, okay? I don't know if he shot that man or not, and couldn't care less at all right?
But you told the police on the 7th day of September that you heard Tony Quince tell Mr. Gibbs that, let me make sure I read it. He said that while they were in the house, somebody come home, and he was scared, and he, Tony, shot him.
I don't know exactly how that got in my statement, but I did not say that.
You didn't say that?
No, sir.
So here's the thing about lying. It's much harder for our brains to remember a lie than it is to remember the truth.
This is this is proven in science and stuff. When you remember something, when you're trying to remember back and you're remembering details, you always remember the same thing. I was sitting in my room, I was watching TV. That doesn't change. When you lie, that memory is not stored in the same part of the brain. So when you're giving details, you're no longer sitting in your room watching TV. Suddenly you're in your car going through the drive-thru at Dairy Queen. The details will change. And every time you recall the real memory, you might remember more details, but what you remember is not going to change. You'll just remember maybe more details. When you're trying to pull up the memory of a lie, the details are going to change because your mind does not store it the way that a real memory would be. So my question is, like with that guy, to me, now, I don't know if they knew it back then, but now in courts, they know, okay, if his story's changing, that's because it's a lie. He's not remembering, he's not telling the truth because he's not able to remember the details correctly. And of course, Daniel's lawyers never questioned anybody, hey, why are you saying this now when in your witness statement you said this? It's like his lawyers never looked at the witness statement or something.
Were Gibbs and Marshall lying? I thought it was definitely possible, especially after I'd received the copy of a letter from Richard Edge, a third inmate who testified in Daniel's trial to help back the prosecution's claim that Daniel and Tony knew each other. In Edge's testimony at trial, he told the jurors that while he was in jail in Talladega County in September of 1996, he had been placed in a cell with Daniel. While Daniel was awaiting trial, he was moved from Chilton County to Talladega County, and jail documentation showed he was indeed in jail at the same time as Richard Edge. Edge said that during their time together, Daniel spoke extensively about the murder, telling Edge that he and Tony had robbed Mike and killed him. Edge was able to provide details about the murder, including the number of times Mike had been shot and the fact that Mike's wallet was missing. Edge also stated Tony had been moved to the Talladega County Jail as well, and that he had overseen sign language conversation between Daniel and Tony during that time. Edge told Greg Biggs, quote, "But they communicated, Quince, QT. He was like in a cell, and the phone was stationed right here, where if you're on the phone, you can look directly into the cell. They'd communicate through hand. I can't show you because I don't know none of them, but they'd do hand languages and communicate back and forth. I was watching one day. That's when I went out of my cell. There was an older man in the cell with me. They left my door open all day, every day, until 10 o'clock at night because this old man had something to where he had to get out and walk. So I'd go out and I'd sit at a table and I'd want to know who he was doing this to, and that's when I found out about QT, and he was doing the hand language."
Then reading through, when I got the bits of his trial transcripts and I sat down and I read through it, I get to Richard Edge's testimony. And reading through that, I'm thinking to myself, were the people in the jury complete friggin' idiots to believe this crap? You're not, he's saying, there was sign language going on, all kinds of stuff. Was walking around, I found this out later, Richard Edge picked Daniel to lie on because Daniel looked like an easy mark because he was walking around carrying his Bible. He was young. He had never been in the prison system or anything like that before, other than, I guess, a DUI here or there or whatever. He obviously, putting this in my kids' terms, he was a noob. He was an easy mark. He wasn't really talking to anybody. He was staying to himself. He always carried his Bible. He was young. He was naive. He looked like fresh meat. That's why Richard Edge picked Daniel to lie on. If you see that picture that was in the newspaper, that article, Daniel's carrying his Bible in that picture.
Right. I personally believe that he was approached by investigators. Can
you say that again, please?
I said I personally believe that he may have been approached by investigators. And the reason I think that is because I don't understand why they would send undercover officers in about Tony and not have done it for Daniel. If they suspected him, you know what I'm saying? There were probably undercover investigators around him that didn't get any information out of him. And so they approached other people that were in the jail at the time and maybe offered them, relief on their sentence or something like that.
From what I understand, Richard Edge actually approached
Mike.
He actually approached the police on that.
Oh, really? Okay.
Bill Pryor.
Yeah.
He wrote a letter to Bill Pryor.
I'm not exactly sure who he approached at first. All I know is that Richard Edge wouldn't have said anything if he wouldn't have gotten a deal.
Right.
Richard Edge was looking at 4 life without parole sentences and 300 and some years added on top of it.
Lord of mercy.
I fact-checked this, of course, and found that Christina was correct. Prior to his testimony, Edge was awaiting trial on 6 felony convictions for burglary and theft of property. Under Alabama's Habitual Offender Act, he should have been sentenced to life without parole. If you aren't familiar with this act, it's meant to work as a deterrent for repeated felonies. If you have 3 or more prior felony convictions and are charged with additional felonies, your sentence will likely result in life without parole. If you don't have 3 felony convictions prior to your charge, you can receive a lesser sentence, but it's still pretty significant, often resulting in a 20-year sentence. In Edge's case, he had already received 4 prior felony convictions, so his 6 felony charges should have definitely resulted in a life without parole sentence, but for some reason, it didn't. After reading over the letter written by Edge, that is, a handwritten, notarized affidavit from Richard Edge himself, stated he had lied during his testimony in exchange for a deal with the prosecution for favorable consideration on his prison term. In his statement, Edge asserted that he was not aware of any conversations between Daniel and Tony, but instead had been fed the information by detectives who, quote, wanted to close their case by any means necessary.
Okay. Well, here, I found it. You can read the Rule 32 I got to argue that I wrote up, like, last week. I can read to you if there's an to.
Yeah.
It said, it's the argument. In 1996, the Assistant Attorney General, Greg Biggs, and Miss Stephanie Billingsley presented evidence to the Court of Coosa County stating they had a witness, Richard Edge, that said, I confessed to him about the ongoing murder case that Coosa County had. Both Assistant Attorney General used Richard Edge's testimony during preliminary hearing to have Bland's case go before the grand jury to bring a wrongfully indictment and conviction. Mr. Biggs and Ms. Billingsley presented to the court false evidence that had you to believe that they had rock-hard facts against Mr. Bland, yet all they had was lies. Richard Edge, the key witness for the Attorney General, had wrote an affidavit. Within the affidavit, it shows that Assistant Attorney General Greg Biggs and Stephanie Billingsley has misled the court to believe Bland was the one who committed the crime.
Daniel read me the entire motion he'd prepared, but for his own privacy, I'm not going to share it here. We'll skip over the remainder of the motion, and I'm going to start you back at the rest of our conversation where Daniel gives me some information about what could happen with his motion.
That's the one I wrote up.
I think that sounds good, but also not just because it sounds good the way it's written, but also because based on the investigation I have done, all of that is accurate. You know what I'm saying?
I know it's accurate.
Do you have the statement that Richard Edge wrote?
About what?
The one that he said, yeah, the like notarized affidavit. Do you have a copy
I have
of
that
it?
affidavit? I read it on what was sent to me.
Okay, yeah. I was gonna say, have you seen it?
I've seen it.
I've been trying to talk to some of the other inmates that testified to see if they were offered any deals, and I haven't gotten in touch with any of them yet. But I'm trying.
Let's see. Now, my last week 32 that I got when Mr. Law got on it, I did that one myself, too.
And that one had a hearing.
Yes. Mr. Rochester's been to hearings. And this is not able to get a hearing. Because they have to address the merit. If they have any type of merit, they have to address it. And that has merit.
I know the audio is really hard to understand, but Daniel told me that once he files this motion, it pretty much has to be addressed by the court in the form of a hearing, as long as the motion has merit. And I'm no expert, but a handwritten statement from an inmate accusing wrongdoing from prosecutors and admitting he perjured himself seems like something that has merit.
What do you think if it goes, if it goes to, from what I understand, if you get granted a hearing and your conviction is essentially overturned, it doesn't necessarily mean that you get out of prison. It basically means that you stay there until the district attorney determines whether or not to retry the case with new evidence.
It's not up to the district attorney to retry the case.
Right. Oh, I mean, I know. I really think that if that were to happen, that they wouldn't retry it, and if they did retry it, it'd be really stupid to do so.
Because if they retry it, they got to come to you. What year did you get that?
Right, and even the evidence that they had was sketchy.
The audio after this is almost unintelligible because Daniel had a bad habit of not talking into the phone at times, so I had to ask him to speak up a bit where I could understand him. What he told me during that time was that because Richard Edge's testimony was used during the grand jury to indict him, Alabama law states he has to be granted a new trial. I haven't been able to confirm that statement, though, so take that with a grain of salt.
So, are you going to submit this one that you just read to me, or are you going to wait?
I'm waiting to see what happens. I've asked God. I was like, before I write, I'm like you, before I write anything, because, I'm illiterate. I'm illiterate of the law. I'm not highball. All I got is a GED high school. A GED thing, you know what I'm talking about?
Well, I've got a college education, and I still don't know. I don't know anything about the law either.
Okay. But I do. And it's not because I sit here and read it. No, I pray about everything. I pray about everything. I was like, God, if I got to write it, because if I don't write it, it's going to bother me. It's going to bother me, it's going to eat at me, and I won't be at peace. So all I ask you to do is just help. Help me write what I need to write. Because you said, God, you're my lawyer. So I need you to write. I need the Holy Spirit to guide me. And this is what it does. Now, where I present it or not, I can't tell you. Now, that's a good one. It's a good one. And it will get me, I truly believe it'll get me an evidentiary hearing.
What if Richard Edge has to testify in that hearing? Do you think it would go in your favor?
Okay. What's he going to testify to? Now, you got an affidavit saying here. Now, you got no affidavit saying here. So what? Which one? You're searching yourself on both, either case. You see what I'm talking about?
If you remember, in a previous episode, I talked briefly about the post-conviction process and told you about a conversation I had with Doyle Fuller about what could be done at this point in Daniel's case. He told me once Daniel's case has gone before the Supreme Court, and it has, that he only has a few options left, all of which are long shots. One of those options would be to file a habeas corpus petition in federal court. I'm going to play you a snippet of this conversation because Doyle explains it a lot better than I can.
So if he went to the Supreme Court and it was denied, is that basically he can't do anything else, or is there something else that he could do?
Well, the only other thing he could possibly do, and it's long shot, would be a habeas corpus petition in federal court, and I don't know that he's done that. There are all kind of procedural hoops you have to jump through, and in fact, I've never handled a federal habeas corpus case, so I don't know exactly what all the details are. That is one possible remedy.
But it's a long shot.
It is a big-time long shot, yeah.
Okay, so let's assume that he's not able to do a habeas corpus, right? But say there was new evidence that was presented in his case. Could you at that point do another motion for a new trial based on new evidence?
It would have to be something that it would have been impossible for him to find for now, for it to have any hope of success. But
okay.
Yeah, it's possible.
I'm trying not to give too much information, but let's say it was the murder weapons, and that it could be, I don't know, DNA tested or something to prove that, his DNA was not on it or something. I mean, other than that, there's no other kind of evidence.
Be something like that. Some DNA evidence. Some conclusive evidence that someone else, in fact, committed the crime, something of that nature.
Right.
And the legal standard is it would have to be evidence that he, through due diligence, could not have found earlier. If it's something he could have found earlier through due diligence, then it would not be a ground for a new trial.
So what if, through all these months of investigation, I did find evidence like this? What could it do for Daniel? Next week on Skeptical.
That's what I was saying. Like, we'd have to come out here one day with a metal detector and just walk around. I'm picking up some iron, Jennifer.
It is very soft.
I said I'm picking up some iron. I would just be willing to bet money that the guns are on this property right here.
Well, that could be. That could be.
Skeptical is a production of Murder Creek Media. It's created, written, and narrated by me. Our associate producers are Emily Christie, Tony Forbes, Camry Council, Lauren Powell, and Chantrice Martin. Special thanks to Bailey Dollar and Clarissa Rambo. You can find out more about us and our work by visiting murdercreekmedia.com. If you're hungry for more, consider joining our premium subscription on Spotify. Unlock exclusive access to unaired content, including extended audio interviews and host commentary, offering a deeper dive into the cases that grip your curiosity. You can also join the conversation online by searching our social handle, SkepticalPod. If you like this episode, we'd love to hear from you. Leaving a review helps us grow and improve, making sure we can continue to bring you the content you crave. Every rating, comment, and share helps others discover our show. Remember, every voice matters in the pursuit of justice. Keep questioning, keep advocating, and together we can make a difference.